Hi, everybody. I don't know why I'm really giggly tonight. Professor King, or today, whenever you're watching this video, this is Professor King. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Stuart Hall's chapter or essay on cultural studies, and its theoretical legacies. I'm also going to be talking about Dick Hebdige's excerpt from Subculture that you can, both of these readings you can find in the anthology, the textbook assigned for this course. So we're going to be applying those to chapters 8 and 9 of Avalona by Isabel Allende. So that's two different theorists, one novel with two different chapters. So there's a lot of fun things we can do with this. And I'm really excited to talk about it because these are some of my favorite schools of theory, and you'll probably see why in a moment. So I'm not going to waste anybody's time here. Let me just take it to a share screen in a moment. All right, and then I will make the slideshow as big as possible. All right, so we're talking about cultural studies and subculture because we can easily talk about them together. And just to give you a little bit of a background, so we'll start with Stuart Hall's cultural studies, but just to give you a little bit of a background before we begin. So Stuart Hall is like the granddaddy, if you will, of cultural studies. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. I believe in like 2014 is when he passed away. But he was influential in bringing this notion of cultural studies to the UK, which then blew up, completely exploded in the US. And it's a really fascinating way of looking at a variety of texts, right? So Hall definitely wanted to apply it to things like literature and television and film and music and art, right? Humanities or arts, liberal arts, broadly based kind of interpretations. But we can really do it with any number of things. And we'll see why and how in a moment. And he's talking about theoretical legacies because he's building on a lot of the stuff that we've now been introduced to in this course, right? People like Foucault and Gramsci, even a little tiny bit of Nietzsche in there, some feminist theory, critical race theory, right? He is examining, if not all, right, because he's very prolific writer and thinker, et cetera, a lot of it. So, and then Dick Hebdige was actually one of his pupils at the CCCS, the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, not Birmingham, right? That's in Alabama, but Birmingham in England, where this, not just this sort of birthplace of cultural studies began, but all of these different sorts of ideas associated with it. So if I seem a little excited, this is why. This is kind of well, for one, this is the lens that I have, the two scholarly peer-reviewed pieces that I've written are heavily influenced by cultural studies, by this very broad and very far-reaching and very, I don't want to use the word intersectional because that, that's Kimberly Crenshaw, and that's a distinctively American sort of approach. But this is definitely a precursor to that notion of intersectionality. So, all right, let's talk Stuart Hall. So in this essay, what you have to understand is, as much as he possibly can, Stuart Hall is trying to pin down a definition of cultural studies for us, where it came from, what it was influenced by, what it means to some extent, and where it's going. And so less so than the other essays we've read in this class, it's not so much a here's this theory on X, right? It's more here's this school and what this entire school of thought could potentially mean, and where it's coming from, and why we need it. And so, it's going to be different than like a Gramsci reading, where Gramsci just has this very specific sort of theory and we apply it in specific ways, right? Hall is more saying like, this is what cultural studies is. And that's deceptive because, as he points out, right, again, it's like a melting puddle spreading in all different directions, we'll say, composed of many different liquids, if we're going to keep that metaphor going. Okay, so it's a field of theoretically engaged cultural analysis that concentrates upon the political dynamics of contemporary culture, its historical foundations, its defining traits, its conflicts, etc. So we have things like not just literary studies, right, but things like sociology, things like politics and Marxism particularly, things like, again, critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory, gender theory, right? All sorts of things that are kind of broadly being brought into this discussion. And again, I use the word intersection very delicately, I guess I should say, because when Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, and we'll read that very soon in this course, when Kimberly Crenshaw is talking about the intersection of identities, she's originally talking about how the individual experiences those intersections, right? And then she later goes on to talk about how, we can have intersectional approaches and all of those sorts of things on a broader scale. And so I don't want to conflate intersectionality with cultural studies, because they're two very distinct things. But in the same way that intersectionality looks at, the overlapping intersections of identity markers within individuals, cultural studies is broadly looking at societies and seeing how these politics and cultural items and identities and et cetera, are all kind of in this gigantic network, constantly making the culture dynamic, right? Which is what makes Hall different from somebody like Louis Althusser, who sees culture in a very kind of stable, unmoving, fixed sort of thing. So it lies at the intersection of sociology and the humanities, especially literature and politics and all those other things I mentioned. But again, I don't want you to conflate cultural studies with what we'll later learn with intersectionality, although there are some similarities, right? It also discusses how cultural practices relate to wider systems of power. Again, we're always talking about power. Associated with, operating through things like ideology, class structure, nation formation, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, generation, etc. So, if you think about how broad and how catch-all just the concept of culture itself is, then to think about how we study that, we have to have a lot of different things going on, right? That's kind of the most simplistic way of putting it. And again, it looks at these cultures as dynamic, right? Any culture that's being studied, or subculture, as we'll talk about in a moment. As dynamic, but also dialogic, meaning like things, people, movements are in conversation with one another, constantly interacting, constantly changing sets of practices and processes that seemingly cannot be contained. So really this flies right in the face of Althusser, where Althusser says culture is this closed system. Hebdige says, oh no, culture and cultural studies are just like blah, 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 right? Like are constantly changing, cannot be contained, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's Stuart Hall right there. What a little cutie. So he starts off with some premises, right? The first one is this notion of looking back to look forward. And this is what every theorist that we've gone over pretty much since the first reading is doing, right? they're looking back at who has influenced them in order to assess what has happened, stake their own claim, right, within that conversation, and then keep that ball moving, right? Because other people are going to come after these theorists, as we've seen, and then build on what they say, just like Hall is doing with Gramsci and Foucault and all these other people, right? And so if culture is dynamic, if it's constantly changing, in order to know it in the present sense, we have to know it as the point in history that it is, right? And he says, well, I know myself, and he's a brilliant guy. He's not talking about himself to kind of just fill pages, right? But he is saying, I'm going to look at this from an autobiographical lens initially, at least, because why else do we do anything we do? If we don't have a personal stake, if the personal is not authoritative and instructive. And actually, this is taken from feminist theory, because in the second wave of feminist theory in the late 60s, early 70s, the big slogan for feminists and early gender theorists of the time was that the personal is political. You may have heard that comes straight out of second wave feminism. And so Hall takes that and says, yeah, right, like we can apply that not just to gender, right, but to any number of cultural studies. So the personal is authoritative, it is instructive, right? And we're going to see this later on with Hebdige when he talks about subculture too. So we'll look at that, right? And Hall's got these two metaphors for describing or defining cultural studies, right? The first one is this notion of theoretical noise and of wrestling with the angels, right? And what he's saying is the whole, look at this dang book. Just look at the thing for a sec. What people are doing, and again, I hate the sleeves, so I take them off, but what people are doing in these gigantic door stoppers of theory anthologies is you don't just read one after the other of someone going, yeah, you know what T.S. Eliot said? Totally cool. Agree with everything. Close the book, right? Like, no. We're wrestling with the angels. In other words, like, these people who've come before us have done really hard work, and we have to appreciate that, but we also have to struggle within this theoretical framework, right? Not just blindly accept the framework, but see what works, see what doesn't, take it all apart, put it all back together, apply it to some cultural phenomenon or context, and then respond to it with our own thoughts and ideas, just like you all do in your essays all the time, right? There's nothing more painful for somebody like me, right? For someone who sits in front of this computer. I mean, I feel like I'm chained to it 24 hours a day at this point, right? But there's nothing more painful for me than to read a student essay where they respond to any writing and they go, you know what? I agree with everything. That was great. Because that is the opposite of critical thought, right? You can be inspired. You can apply the ideas to something you're noticing. You can disagree and have a whole fun, skeptical, gadfly essay of how you think the theory is BS. But the nail in the coffin, right? The kiss of death is to just say, you know what this guy said in this piece of writing? Yep, agree with everything. Totally cool. Because you're not engaging, right? You're just, it's called this guy Paulo Freire called it the banking model of education, where you honestly just like digest all, I mean, not literally digest, but like metaphorically digest all of it and then just go, okay, and guess what? I can say it back to you, right? That's not critical thought. What critical thought is this wrestling with the angels, right? Struggling with the theoretical framework, asking questions, disagreeing, applying, synthesizing, all these sorts of things, right? And the other metaphor for cultural studies that Hall comes up with is this notion of interruption, right? If we have a culture, again, that's dynamic, but kind of ebbs and flows, things are going to interrupt that culture and change it, right, in order to make it dynamic. So interruption is allowing that which has been unheard or overlooked to interrupt the status quo of culture and cultural studies, right? So can you believe that we existed in a time when women, at least in, you know, the Western world, we'll say, and the Western tradition, didn't have the exact same full rights as men? I know. Hold on to your hats. Um, so we have things like feminism and the women's movement, right? And again, because I'm more familiar with the Western cultural context, I'm only going to speak on that. We have these movements that say, hey, maybe people of all genders should get paid the same, right? Hey, maybe it shouldn't be legal to rape your wife, right? Hey, maybe women should be able to get a credit card without having their husband sign for it, you know, which was a thing until like the late 1980s, by the way. All these sorts of things, right? So in other words, that cultural movement, that interruption had to happen in order to change culture and to make it what it is today. And guess what? Interruptions are still happening, right? We have interruptions happening today that are saying things like, hey, maybe we shouldn't treat all people with mental illness like they're criminals, right? Maybe we shouldn't treat, you know, maybe we shouldn't keep people who are in prison for nonviolent offenses incarcerated, right? Like, again, these, and there are millions of examples of that, but they are things that change our culture, right? even Trump, right? Tea Party, Trump, all of that, right? That was an interruption to what our culture kind of thought it was in the moment, right? And Trumpism and that populist sort of right-wing ideology, right? That changed the landscape and, you know, interrupted our culture. You know, that's, I'll just hold my breath on my opinions about that, but that's another example of an interruption, right? And by the way, I'm just living right now for the idea of someone who supports Trump and potentially hates feminism, just looking at that and going, oh my gosh, we have something in common with feminists. Right? Like, it just makes my little heart stars fly out of my chest. Anyway, I digress. So then we get to this notion of synthesis and tension, right? And to illustrate this, Hall talks about the AIDS crisis, right? The synthesis and the tension between the intellectual and the practical. You know, the LGBTQIA plus community has clearly suffered its less than fair share, and by less than fair share, I mean a lion's share, right, of struggles and pain and injustices, right, for years. And I know probably most people watching this video were not alive or around to remember a whole lot of the AIDS crisis when it was at its height, but it was terrifying. And what Hall talks about, right, is how this very and not practical in like a I'm logical way, but practical in like this is a real life thing that happened, right? This very real thing interrupted culture, right? And changed the sort of landscape of how we dealt with things like, you know, sexuality, how we dealt with things like queerness, right? How we dealt with members of, you know, certain socioeconomic or ethnic groups. How we saw our government respond to this. And so, you know, this idea of synthesis and tension of the intellectual and the practical, right? This is a great example of when those things collide. And a cultural studies theorist is going to look at the AIDS crisis from any number of angles, right? What it meant for our culture, how it was displayed in the art and artifacts of our culture, how it was silenced, how it was contested, how it interrupted, right? How it was synthesized, the tensions that it caused. And so, you know, that's a sort of argument by example that Hall gives on that. Then he moves on to this notion of decentering, right? Which takes itself, I mean, let's not kid around. The idea of decentering comes straight from post-structuralism, straight from postmodernism, right? This idea of destabilization. This is not, you know, this is not brand new to cultural studies. And if you think about cultural studies, it kind of is this like Frankenstein mishmash of all of these things that came before it, right? In order to, again, synthesize, interrupt, create tension, to consider a particular moment in culture, right? So decentering, right, which we take straight from post-structuralism, straight from postmodernism, looks at, you know, and considers the constantly destabilizing nature of culture and studies it because that's what culture is, right? Unlike Althusser says, right, it's not a fixed system, it's changing. And so these schools and these theories and these institutions that cultural studies particularly looks at, feminism, race, class, sexuality, etc., right? We're not just looking at intersections, we're looking at how they exist within culture on their own, together, perhaps in intersection, tangentially, right, etc., etc. So next, again, we have a protege of Stuart Hall, who is still alive and who actually, if I'm not mistaken, still works out of UC Santa Barbara. He's from England, grew up in London, some part of England, might have been Birmingham too. Don't quote me, but I know it's England for sure. Anyways, he's at UCSB as far as I can remember now, and that's Dick Hebdige. And Dick Hebdige in the late 70s writes this explosive book called Subculture. And in this book, he talks exactly about that. And you got to think, a guy from England in the late 70s, what subculture is he going to focus on? Well, you're right. It's punk, right? He looks at punk subculture. And he talks about some other sort of youth subcultures or music related subcultures, things like the Teddy Boys or the Rockers or the Mods, that had particular significance in England up to that point. Sorry, my dog Coleslaw is interrupting this video. It's her birthday, by the way, November 8th. Today it's her birthday, so happy birthday. All right, anyway, let's get back to the video. So Hebdige is the first one to come along in a concrete and specific way and talk about subculture, and not just punk subculture specifically, but this can apply to any and all, particularly youth or music subcultures, but any and all subcultures in general. And so what is a subculture? It's a subset of a given society that deviates from the dominant or the mainstream in certain ways, but conforms in others, right? So, you know, if we deviated from society in every way, think about that. Like, if I deviated from Southern California, American capitalist, you know, quasi-democratic country or culture that I'm in right now, right? If I went to go live in a cabin in the woods and went off the grid and got rid of all my electronics and decided not to have a partner and never bathed again, I don't know, foraged all of my food, you know, I wouldn't be interacting with the culture that much. I wouldn't, you know, I would be outside of the bounds. But let's say I'm that same Katie and I like become, I don't know, I become like a big K-pop fan, right? And I start dressing according to, you know, what the sort of look of K-pop is, and I know all the songs and I go to all the concerts. um I still live in my house in Long Beach, right? I still engage on a regular daily basis. I go to the grocery store, I wash my hair, right? Like, in other words, I conform to society in certain ways, but I deviate from it in others. And so that's what he's talking about, right? Like, people who live, like, have you seen those memes? Like, we live in a society, right? People who live within a certain society and follow some of the rules, but don't follow others. But they don't follow the rules in specific ways, right? Like, a goth, a goth kid is going to be very different from like someone who goes to Burning Man, who's going to be very different from like, you know, a skate rapper, who's going to be different from, you know, whoever, right? A K-pop fan. So they're pushing against the dominant culture in their own specific codified ways, right? And the expression is noise, right? And he's taking this from Hall, but he's building on it. The expression is noise, right? We're using style to redefine that which has been pre-designated by the dominant culture. In other words, we are taking the style markers of the dominant culture and we're kind of screwing with them in a way, right? We're making them chaotic in a way. And this is semiotic, meaning it's done at the level of signification, meaning, or value. Kind of like, I think when we talked about Nietzsche, we talked about this, which is like, you know, this thing, right? Oh gosh, this hellish device, right? That has my dogs on it. Right? Like, this in and of itself only has meaning insofar as I and everyone in this culture have given it meaning, right? In other words, like, I call this a phone or a cell phone, whereas someone else might call it telefono, right? Whereas someone else might call it jar, right? Like, and then I assign meaning to it, right? Like, I need my cell phone on me at all times, or I hate my cell phone, or my cell phone is my life, or whatever, right? I assign meaning and value to this thing. And we all do that, right? We're all doing that. What someone in a subculture does is then takes that semiotic value and kind of twists a politically resistant vein into it, if you will. Politically resistant thread, okay? So, you know, if I'm in like a hacker subculture, like, or like a black hat, white hat, I think it's what it's called, you know, I might use my phone then to like hack into things, like the people who just hacked into Trump's Twitter account, and, you know, ingeniously the password was MAGA 2020. I mean, like, how much more brilliant can you get as the leader of the free world? But, you know, if I were a hacker or like a black hat, white hat, this thing that has, you know, a relatively banal significance for everybody else then has that politically resistant significance of, I'm going to go in, do, 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 beep, 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 bop, beep, bop. That's how I think of all like super smart computer people, like everything they do. There's just a constant beep, bop going on in the background. But anyway, I'm going to take this, right? And I'm going to use that politically resistant sort of element to it, right? And so when we think about subculture, what characterizes it? Well, things like otherness, protest, critique. And when we're talking about protest and critique, we're talking about of a culture, right? Cultural protest, cultural critique, communality, social transformation, right? So even like the people who, you know, they've been called like anti-maskers or mask holes, right? Like, they're doing the same thing, right? Like, they are sort of standing against the whatever sheeple, right? Like the people who believe in science and can read, like at above a 6th grade level. They're standing apart from that aspect of our culture and saying, I'm not like that, right? Like, I'm not going to believe your misinformation. Instead, I'll go to QAnon, read an article written by somebody who can barely just bang monosyllabic word after monosyllabic word together. and then I don't know, like, believe what this guy has to say, that like, what's, that Beyonce's an Italian woman, or that like lesbians eat brains, or whatever else is on QAnon that day, which is usually like completely unfathomably ridiculous. But that's their protest and critique. The fact that they're not wearing masks, that's their semiotic message, right? Like, that's their way of saying, like, I'm different, I'm politically outside of the box, like, I'm other, I'm willing to, I'm willing to risk the life of not only myself, but everyone in my family, and particularly anyone who has pre-existing conditions, or who's on any sort of like immunosuppressants, because of this thing I believe in very deeply, right? And I'm going to show everybody that by not wearing a mask. So, Hebdige talks about subculture in an incredibly positive way. Like, he's a big fan of the punk movement, so he talks about it in these glowing ways. But, sometimes subculture is not that glowing, right? So he has this notion of the unnatural break, right? And he says things like spectacular subcultures express forbidden contents, right? Consciousness of class, consciousness of difference in forbidden forms, transgression, law breaking, etc. And he says they're profane meaning like profane, right? Not sacred, profane articulations that unmask that which is presumed natural in the dominant culture. So again, if we think about the anti-maskers as an example, right? Spectacle. When he says spectacular, he doesn't mean like amazing. He means spectacle. And a spectacle is something that has to be viewed in the public sphere, right? So spectacular subcultures, the ones that we see in public, express forbidden contents, right? Forbidden contents like, I don't know, not agreeing with science. That would be like a consciousness of difference in forbidden forms. So the not wearing a mask would be the forbidden form, right? Like, most people look at that and go, ugh, like, why would you want to put, even more than the 250,000 lives that have already been lost? Like, why would you want to put lives at risk by not wearing a mask? That's a forbidden form, right? It's a transgression. It's a profane articulation, meaning it's a vulgar display, right? That unmask which is presumed in the dominant culture, right? Like, how many times have we seen examples of that and gone, oh, people, it's like that other meme, you really live like this, right? People really think like this. And so the dominant culture looks at that and goes, ugh, right? And that would be like a more painful example. But where we talk about things like punk rock, right, especially in the late 70s in England, the spectacle is the thing like the mohawk, or the fried bleached hair, the studs, the pins, the safety pin through the nose, right? And those express forbidden contents. You have things like BDSM culture coming out of punk, right? Or kind of dovetailing with it. You have, self-harm, whether for a spectacle or, to point at something deeper. You have, peace punk and crust punk that interrogate class distinctions, right? You have all these different sorts of things, that the average person at the time is looking at going, why do you want to put a safety pin through your nose? Why do you want to bleach your hair till it's fried, right? Why do you want to cut your hair in that way or wear those uncomfortable clothes? And it's because these people in this subculture are articulating that sort of profane message, right? Um, and we have the moral panic, right? Where the style of a subculture is witnessed and then both celebrated and ridiculed by the mainstream culture. So, like, if you think about punk, right? What happened? First, there was the moral panic of like, oh, these people are gonna, ruin our society, or like there was like the satanic panic of the 80s, or even the way people approach rap or maybe K-pop. I don't know enough about K-pop to know if people have moral panic about K-pop. But it's sort of made novel, right, in certain ways, but then it's ridiculed in other ways. Think about the hipsters, right? Like, that's another one. There are things about the hipsters that people celebrate, like the environmental consciousness, the sort of analog return to the basics kind of stuff. And then there's the stuff that people ridicule, right? Like the snobbery or the pretentiousness. So anyway, let's move on. Well, we'll keep going, I'll say. Next, we'll talk about incorporation and recuperation. So we have the commodity form, we have the ideological form. The commodity form is the conversion of subcultural signs, those semiotic signs that I talked about 2 slides ago, right? When those are made mainstream, then they lose their political radical significance, okay? If you saw somebody walking around, I mean, even like in the early to mid 2000s, right? The aughts. If I saw somebody with a mohawk or a faux hawk, I'd be like, oh, it's just another guy, right? Whereas if I saw that person in 76 with that, I'd be like, whoa, freaky, right? So when things become mainstream, they lose their radical significance, right? The commodified form, that social or that cultural item that was taken from the mainstream culture, repurposed to fit the needs of the subculture, is then reintroduced into the mainstream culture and loses its radical significance, like the mohawk, right? Mohawk is taken from, it's really culturally appropriated from very old, indigenous cultures and things like that. Then the punks took it, and now mainstream culture has absorbed it, and anyone who sees someone with a mohawk is like, whatever, right? That would be the commodity form, the mohawk. The ideological form is the labeling or redefining of deviant behavior by dominant groups vis-a-vis identification by the dominant culture, right? So in other words, the other is trivialized, naturalized, domesticated. That's what I was talking about when I'm talking about like the hipster, and I'll talk about that in relation to this photograph in just a moment. And the other is transformed in a meaningless exotica, right? It's a spectacle or a clown. So I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory. I'm sure most of you look at this photo and go, Coachella, right? And we think about Coachella, and in 2020 or 2021 or whenever you watch this video, Coachella has become this overarching, mainstream, hyper expensive capitalist endeavor, right? It's literally operated by a billionaire who has funded tons of anti-LGBTQ legislation. Doesn't get more mainstream than that, right? Having tons of money and hating gay people, at least right now in our cultural moment, right? And yet when Coachella started in 99, it started in 99. I was 16 the year that it started. So I didn't go to the first Coachella. And I actually did not go to the second time they had it, which was in 2001. But at the time, Coachella was one day, it was $65 a ticket. It was still in the Coachella Valley, hence the name, right? But there weren't anywhere near this, there was not anywhere near this kind of hyper commodification of the music scene. You had a lot of overseas bands, and at the time, I mean, the internet wasn't in its infancy, but this was before things like Facebook and social media, and you know, the internet landscape at the time was very different. I mean, you had MySpace, you know, like that'll contextualize it in history for you. It was one day, $65, a lot of no-name bands, a lot of bands from out of the country. At the time, I had a friend who worked at this, it was a mod club, that subculture that Hebdige talks about. It was a mod club in LA called Bang. And if you worked the coat check at Bang for one night, you could get tickets to Coachella. And now if you think about Coachella, right, it's like, what, like the cheapest ticket is like $500, and you know, it looks like Disneyland, and you see, you know, you see guys chugging Budweiser with a really offensive, you know, headdress on, and it's just like, it's just the gaudiest of what mainstream American culture has to offer, right? Coachella is a great example of both the commodity form and the ideological form being redefined once it gets absorbed in the mainstream or dominant culture, right? Back in my day, right? Back in 2001, when I could have gotten free tickets to Coachella for working the door at Bang for a night, you know, I would have just gone and seen like a bunch of scrawny, pale kids like myself with tattoos and like short black hair, like rocking out to like some British bands and like maybe a couple of rap acts, you know? And then as the years go by and it gets, you know, more and more traction, and the dominant culture starts to see it as a money-making venture, right? Then you have like MTV getting in on it, and you have, you know, like these major sort of investors getting in on it. And then it becomes this thing that is, you know, naturalized, it's domesticated, it becomes meaningless, right? Like where someone who can go see Ariana Grande at the Staples Center is now going to this thing where you could, you know, you used to only be able to see these very like underground bands, right? The meaning of that is lost, right? It becomes, I mean, it's literally a spectacle. Think about what's the first thing people do when they get to Coachella? They take photos of themselves in public, literally a public display to show that they are there, right? That this sort of cultural moment has been achieved for them, right? That they are part of this sort of dominant culture. And the meaning of it has changed significantly. The person who you would have seen at Coachella in 99 and 2001 is not the person you're going to see at Coachella whenever, you know, it opens back up. So we have to think about that, right? Same thing with hipsters. Hipsters weren't always called hipsters. They used to just be called nerds, right? Like, and they, you know, again, they like go to shows or films that nobody cared about. And then all of a sudden it becomes this marketable strategy, same thing as grunge in the 90s, right? And then it becomes this sort of meaningless exotica, right? This clownified sort of thing. Anyway, this might be a good time to take a pause before we get to talking about Avalona. But I want you to think about this stuff that Hebdige talks about and that Hall talks about, right? So try to think of a subculture that's not music related and apply the ways in which we've seen elements of its style, society's moral panic and reaction to it, or the ways in which it's been incorporated by mainstream culture. So just maybe do like a little brainstorm on your own about like, you know, a subculture you've seen. And then talk about it. Hebdige, one of the critiques of Hebdige is that he focuses too heavily on style, right? On like the safety pins and the leather jackets of the punk movement, but not enough on the meaning, right? And so, or the other aspects of it, to the detriment of its relevance to society overall. Do you agree with that critique or not? Think about, again, don't just say, oh, Hebdige, okay, I agree. Have a critical thought, right? And then finally, are subcultures all doomed to be swallowed up by the mainstream, or is there hope for some sort of subcultural transformation where the subculture can stay intact, right? Doesn't get swallowed up, in other words. Why or why not? So again, think about those for a moment, pause, and then I'll move on momentarily. I'm out of water too, so my throat is like, rawr. All right, now let's pivot to Avalona. Some things in Avalona you want to make sure you know about, right, before you move on and start to synthesize these readings with the chapters we've covered so far. Somebody dies by suicide at the beginning of chapter 8. Who dies? Who is believed to have killed the person who dies by suicide? Then Ava is reunited with someone in a church of all places. That should give you a hint. At the end of chapter 8. Whom does Ava reunite with in a church at the end of chapter 8? And then I love the way I ask questions. I'm laughing at my own jokes here, guys. With whom does Ava become reunited and a little more in chapter 9? Right. So again, maybe pause, make sure you know the answers. If you don't, go back and do some skimming and highlighting of Avalona just to refresh your memory. Maybe you read it earlier, the beginning of the week or something. Check it out. And then next slide. So let's think about Hall and Hebdige when we think about Avalona, right? Because now at this point in this picaresque novel, Ava has gone to all these different places, right? The Capitol, for, you know, Professor Jones's laboratory, I call it Agua Caliente, but I know that's not right. You know, she goes to the country. She's in all kinds of places, right? And because of that, she's seeing all of these different aspects of this cultural landscape. She's seeing the geographical landscape, but she's also seeing the cultural landscape and the variety that there is to offer within this cultural landscape, right? And time is progressing, right? So think about all we've seen so far and think about cultural changes that are occurring within the novel, maybe in terms of racial politics, class politics, gender politics, sexual orientation politics, etc., right? In terms of the culture, right? And how is what we're seeing perhaps decentering or destabilizing or interrupting or creating tension within the existing culture of the fictional world of Avalona? There are these movements that are happening, right? There are these major things that are happening that are destabilizing that moment in the culture's time. So what are they and how and why are they doing that? And also think about the subcultures that we're seeing at work in the novel. Again, they may not be music related. They may not be youth related. How do they operate at the cultural level, at a political level, at the artistic level? What's their significance in the novel? And how do they exist with that mainstream culture that exists within the novel, right? You know, and subcultures can be religious. They can be, like I've pointed out, political. They can be music related. They can be, you know, hobby related. But let's think about them in terms of how Hebdige talks about them. So I'll leave it on here so you have time to copy these down and think about them and brainstorm them and apply them to your reading of the novel. But I really want you to think about this stuff because, like I said, this stuff is my bread and butter. Like I will talk cultural studies all day. And the great thing about cultural studies is you can approach it from any number of lenses, right? Gender, race, class, sexuality, ability status, mental health status, right? Like there's so many different ways we can, and you can look at film, you can look at books, you can look at art, you can look at biography, you can look at politics, right? Like there's so much you can do with it. It's really cool stuff. So if this interests you, you might want to do some more research since the annotated bibliography and final essay are on the horizon. All right, well, I'm going to take it off share screen. I hope I wasn't too wacky or kooky in this video, but if I was, welcome to my world. If you ever have questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening, day, whatever it is. All right, bye.